They didn't want me.
Did that hurt you?
No. How could it hurt me? Not at all.
In the golden age of Hollywood, few women were as unforgettable as Marlene Dietrich. With her striking voice, effortless elegance, and a presence that felt both distant and magnetic, she became one of the most desired women in the world. To millions, her life appeared almost perfect, filled with glamour, admiration, and endless attention. But behind the spotlight, her story followed a far more complicated path. She loved deeply, she lived freely, and she rarely stayed where the world expected her to. Yet, in the quiet final years of her life, one truth became clearer than ever. Among all the men who passed through her life, there were a few she never truly forgot. Tell me, do you believe love needs to last to be real? The marriage she never left, Rudolf Sieber. Long before Marlene Dietrich became one of the most fascinating women in Hollywood, she made a choice that seemed, at the time, simple and traditional. In 1923, she married Rudolf Sieber, a German assistant director who lived far from the glamour and intensity that would later define her life. Back then, she was still unknown, still searching, still years away from becoming the woman the world would one day watch so closely. Their marriage began quietly, without the drama or attention that would follow her in later years, and in many ways, it remained quiet, even as everything else in her life began to change. As Dietrich's career took her across Europe and eventually to Hollywood, distance slowly became part of their relationship. Her world expanded, filled with powerful figures, admiration, and opportunity. His remained steady, grounded, and far removed from the spotlight. Over time, their lives moved in different directions. There were other relationships, other emotional connections that would come to define her story far more deeply than this marriage ever did. And yet, she never ended it. Not once. They had a daughter together, and in their own way they remained connected, not through passion, but through understanding. There were no public conflicts, no dramatic separation, only a quiet acceptance of the life she had chosen to live. To some, it seemed unusual. To others, it seemed practical. But perhaps, for Dietrich, this marriage represented something more personal, something untouched by fame, a connection to the life she had before the world began watching her. And even as everything else changed, she held on to that one promise. Some commitments are not kept for love. They are kept for something deeper. The man she couldn't have. Gary Cooper. By the time Marlene Dietrich arrived in Hollywood at the start of the 1930s, she already carried an aura that felt different from every other actress of her time. There was a quiet confidence in the way she moved, a sense that she was always slightly in control, even when the world around her seemed uncertain. And it was during this early chapter of her American career that she met a man who would leave a lasting mark on her life. His name was Gary Cooper. They met while working on the film Morocco in 1930, a project that would become one of the defining moments of Dietrich's rise to international fame. Cooper was already a well-established star, calm, understated, and deeply admired by audiences. On screen, their chemistry was undeniable. But away from the cameras, something more personal began to grow. Their connection was not loud or dramatic. It developed quietly, through shared moments between scenes, through long conversations, and through a mutual understanding that didn't need to be explained. For Dietrich, who often kept her emotions carefully guarded, this bond felt rare. But there was a reality neither of them could ignore. Gary Cooper was married. And unlike some of the other men who would pass through Dietrich's life, Cooper was not willing to leave his family behind. No matter how strong the connection became, there was always a boundary that could not be crossed. For Dietrich, that truth carried a quiet weight. She could have continued the relationship in the shadows, as many in Hollywood often did. But this was different. This was not just another passing romance. This was something that asked for more than circumstances would allow. So eventually, she stepped away. Not because the feelings had faded, but because they could not become what she truly wanted. And perhaps that is why, years later, when she looked back on her life, his name remained. Sometimes the love that feels the most real is the one you cannot keep. The love that asked too much. Jean Gabin. By the late 1930s, Marlene Dietrich was no longer just a rising star. She was an established name, moving between continents, admired not only for her beauty, but for the quiet authority she carried wherever she went. And it was during this chapter of her life that she met a man who, unlike many others, did not chase her image. His name was Jean Gabin. Gabin was one of France's most respected actors, strong, grounded, and deeply connected to his homeland. Where many men were drawn to Dietrich's glamour, Gabin seemed to look past it. He saw the woman beneath the carefully constructed persona, and for a time, that made their connection feel different. Their relationship grew during a period marked by uncertainty, as Europe stood on the edge of war. In those years, their bond carried a sense of intensity, not built on fleeting attraction, but on shared moments, long conversations, and a feeling of stability that Dietrich rarely allowed herself to depend on. But stability came with a condition. Gabin wanted a life rooted in France, a home, a future that followed a more traditional path. For Dietrich, that kind of life came at a cost. Her career was not something she was willing to leave behind. The independence she had fought to build, the freedom to move, to choose, to remain in control of her own life, was something she could not easily give up, even for love. And so, what began with deep understanding slowly turned into quiet conflict. Not because the feelings disappeared, but because their lives were moving in different directions. In the end, there was no dramatic ending, no public collapse, just a choice. And sometimes, the hardest part of love is not losing it. It is choosing not to follow where it leads. The man who understood her mind, Erich Maria Remarque. By the early 1940s, Marlene Dietrich had already experienced the kind of relationships that were intense, complicated, and often shaped by circumstances beyond her control. But then she met someone who connected with her in a very different way. Not through glamour, not through public attention, but through thought. His name was Erich Maria Remarque. Remarque was a celebrated German novelist, best known for his reflections on war and human suffering. He carried a depth that set him apart from the Hollywood world Dietrich had grown used to. With him, conversations were not about fame or appearances. They were about life, memory, and the quiet weight of experience. Their relationship unfolded through letters as much as it did in person. Words became their way of understanding one another. Long, thoughtful exchanges filled with emotion, honesty, and reflection revealed a side of Dietrich that few ever saw. With Remarque, she didn't need to perform. She didn't need to maintain the carefully controlled image the world expected from her. Instead, she could simply exist, as a woman shaped by her past, her choices, and her contradictions. But even this kind of connection had its limits. Their lives were still moving in different directions. Careers, distance, and the demands of the world around them made it difficult to hold on to something that required time and presence. And while the emotional bond remained strong, the relationship itself could not fully settle into something lasting. Still, what they shared did not fade easily. Because some connections are not defined by how long they last, but by how deeply they are felt. And in a life filled with many relationships, this was one of the few where Marlene Dietrich allowed herself to be truly understood. With him, she was not an icon. She was simply herself. The affairs that meant nothing. As the years passed, Marlene Dietrich's name became inseparable from a certain kind of mystery. She was admired, desired, and often surrounded by some of the most well-known men of her time. Actors, musicians, writers, many were drawn to her presence, and many for a time became part of her story. There were names that appeared briefly, almost like passing moments. Men like Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Yul Brynner, and others whose connections with Dietrich never fully settled into something lasting. Some relationships were built on attraction, others on curiosity, and a few simply existed because of the world she lived in, a world where proximity often turned into something more, even if only for a short while. But unlike the deeper connections she experienced with certain men, these relationships followed a different pattern. They did not ask for permanence, they did not demand sacrifice, and perhaps most importantly, they did not leave lasting marks. Dietrich understood the difference. She moved through these moments with a kind of emotional control that few people truly recognized. While others might have been carried away by attention or desire, she remained aware of what these connections were and what they were not. There was no illusion of forever. In many ways, these relationships reflected the life she had chosen. A life where freedom came first, where attachment was measured carefully, and where not every connection needed to become a story worth remembering. To the outside world, it may have seemed like a series of romances, but to her, they were something else entirely. Moments. And sometimes, the difference between a moment and a memory is everything. The truth she never said publicly. By the time Marlene Dietrich entered the final years of her life, the world she had once moved through so effortlessly had grown quieter. The film sets were gone. The constant attention had faded. What remained instead was time. Time to reflect, to remember, and perhaps to understand her own story more clearly. She had lived a life filled with admiration, independence, and choices few women of her era were ever allowed to make. She had loved more than once, walked away more than once, and built a life that never followed the path others expected. But in those quieter years, something shifted. The question was no longer about how many people had been part of her life. It became about who had truly stayed in her memory. There were many names, many moments, many connections that had once felt important, but as time moved forward, most of them faded into the background, like scenes from a film slowly losing their detail. Only a few remained clear, and among them, one stood apart. Not because it lasted the longest, not because it was the most convenient, but because it was never fully replaced. Gary Cooper. The man she could not have became the one she never quite let go of. It was not something she often spoke about openly. Dietrich was always careful with her words, protective of the parts of her life that felt most personal. But those who knew her understood that some feelings do not disappear, even when life moves on. They simply remain unchanged. And in the end, after everything she had experienced, everything she had chosen, and everything she had left behind, she knew exactly which love had been real. Because sometimes the love that doesn't last is the one that never truly leaves. The life of Marlene Dietrich reminds us that even the most admired figures carry stories the world never fully sees. Behind the elegance, the confidence, and the carefully controlled image was a woman who lived on her own terms, loving without apology, and leaving when she had to. She did not follow the rules of her time. She did not stay where she was expected. And yet, in the quiet moments of her life, it became clear that not every love fades with distance. Some remain long after everything else has changed. Perhaps that is the truth her story leaves behind. Tell me, do you think her greatest love was the one she lost? If you enjoyed timeless Hollywood stories like this, consider subscribing.